Now that Caesar's been, and now that Caesar's gone, what happens? What is the ultimate experience that most of our British Iron Age peoples have felt? What do they think is going on? And what do they see as being the important takeaway from all of this new messy neighbor that's shown up, pushed themselves over, tried to take a bunch of resources away, and then just left? We're going to find out. Welcome back to Roman Britain, and it is episode 3, Festina, Lente. Salvete, and welcome back. In our last episode, we followed Julius Caesar across the channel and watched his brief but dramatic encounter with the tribes of Britain in 55 and 54 BCE. His legions clashed with British chariots and demanded hostages and then withdrew. For Rome, these expeditions were useful propaganda. They set in place the composite idea that Caesar was able to do something that no one else could, and it set in motion an idea that they could conquer Britain. However, for the British population that were disrupted, did they just basically go back to normal life? Did everything just go back to normal because they weren't really bothered by all of this? In this episode, which is subtitled Makes Haste Slowly, we explore how Britons remembered Caesar, how Gaul's conquest reshaped their world, and how Roman goods and Roman politics were trickling into Britain, and how often ordinary people really encountered the Romans in this time of interlude before the Claudian invasions. So, what do they remember at this point? Caesar's invasion did not really leave a permanent mark on the landscape. We have some archaeological evidence, but even that's very small and very tiny and inconsequential, really, to the overall shape of Iron Age Britain at the time. We know that Cassivellaunus of the Catuvallani led the resistance in 54 BCE, and Caesar described his tactics as guerrilla warfare with ambushes and the use of chariots to speed in and launch attacks. The very image of the Britons that would fascinate Rome for generations. Though defeated, Cassivellaunus was not crushed. Caesar withdrew voluntarily, claiming victory but leaving no garrisons behind, no troops, no invasion force, no colonists, no real remnant of Roman civilization. And I think that's an important point. I think that's something we take a little bit for granted here. You have to remember it will be 90 years before the Romans return. There is a large gap between the two. And because of this, Rome's effect on Iron Age Britain is not as big as it might have been had they tried to stay. And I think that's important to remember. Yes, there's influence we'll talk about, but when you look at it in the long run, the influence of that particular moment was, for at least them, small. Unfortunately for them, for the Romans, it was much bigger. But for the Britons, the message was generally complex. They had faced Rome and survived, but they had also seen a kind of warfare unlike their own, with disciplined infantry, heavy cavalry, siege engines, and strange thunder of marching formations. Again, we talk a little bit about how the British military force was much more cavalry oriented, or much more chariot oriented. It was much more built around speed and momentum and quick movement and attacks that would come out of nowhere. The Romans were not like that. They were very much a in your face, hard fighting, and they're going to come at you as hard as they can. And realistically, that is something that we will talk about in a later episode where we'll go over what exactly makes up the Roman military at this time. What do they look like? What makes them so effective in this particular age, and why is it that the tribes of Britain struggle so much against them when actually fighting them, especially in places where it's flat ground, where there isn't a lot of cover, compared to, say, the mountainous areas of Wales or Scotland, where things will be a lot more difficult for the Romans. So, when talking about that, let's bring forward an example. So, we're going to have a couple of vignettes, kind of examples of what might have been going on at this time in Britain. It's obviously just an imaginative, fun thing rather than specifically, yes, this is sure what happened. But let's start in a smoky hall somewhere between Herefordshire. A warrior speaks to his kin. Quote, "They moved like one creature," he says, "shield against shield, iron flashing in the sun." He tells of their cavalry, of wooden towers and that were dragged across fields. His listeners shift uneasily. These were no raiders to be brushed aside. But the storyteller ends with a smile. Quote, "And yet they left. They came, they fought, they boasted, but they sailed away." Beyond the Thames Valley, Caesar's legions were really only stories. Few would have any real idea who they were or what they were. In Wales, the Midlands, and Scotland, life went on unchanged. But in the tales, of course, would travel. Likely similar to the game of telephone, the story carried differently from place to place. Were they men? Were they gods incarnate? Or were they simply demons sent by an evil god in order to punish the British for some reason? Across the generations, Caesar's name became shorthand for a distant, powerful world, one that coastal tribes and kingdoms would become much more familiar with as time went on and more contact, of course, was made. Now, as the Britons were getting used to the new situation, so too was this situation changing in a place like Gaul. The true turning point for their Gaulish neighbors came not from Caesar's raids, but from his conquest. Completed in 51 BCE, overnight Britain's nearest neighbor ceased to be a patchwork of Gallic tribes and became instead a Roman province with all the culture and benefits and negatives that a Roman province gives you. As Professor Barry Cunliffe notes, quote, "The Channel ceased to be a frontier between similar peoples. It became a boundary between a Roman province and an independent island world." End quote. Now, every voyage across the water passed through Roman-controlled ports. Custom posts and taxation replaced the easy reciprocity of tribal trade. For British elites, this was both a peril and a possibility. Those who forged ties with Roman officials could secure wealth and prestige. Those who resisted, of course, risked isolation. It also means more and safer trade routes, because if there was one thing the Romans brought, it was organization and a willingness to share with those that enriched it. Wood, textiles, and imported copper and tin were key trading pieces for both Romans who craved them and for the Britons to sell. The Channel itself became a living border. The cry of gulls over Dover's cliffs simply were a sign that ships were rocking from the swells of Boulogne along both shores, bringing trade back and forth. People were learning new rhythms. Trade winds, not war horns, carried the sound of Rome to Britain. However, the sense of safety, of course, had been breached. Britons had confronted the biggest of their boogeymen and had met them. Had they bested them, or had they just survived them? They really didn't know. And I wonder if at least some of the British people were now questioning that particular argument. Of course, the Britons did not suddenly lose control or contact with the rest of Europe. Far from it, of course. Archaeology shows that contact, of course, did not end with Caesar. Instead, one would argue it flourished. At sites across Kent and Essex, amphorae of Italian wine appeared in growing numbers. Roman fine wares, such as terra sigillata, glassware, and bronze vessels entered Britain in the late 1st century BCE. They were not household goods for common farmers, but prestige items for feasts and burials. You can imagine how these were perceived as more and more luxury items were traded. At Hengistbury Head in Dorset, excavations revealed a major late Iron Age port. Imported goods flowed in. British exports of metal, grain, slaves, and hunting dogs flowed out. Coins and weights hinted at the growing sophistication that was involved there. British traders adopted Gallic and even Roman measures to keep accounts. Monetary value might not exist, but the first steps were being made towards that system. And of course, a very Roman version of that system. Returning to our another vignette, we have a trader who returns. A boat scrapes against the shingles of the Kentish shore. From its hold, men unload heavy amphorae, each sealed with resin and stamped with Roman maker's marks. A local chief watches closely. The jars will not be opened casually. They will be saved for a feast where each guest will see that he, and only he, controls access to Roman riches. The amphorae are more than wine. They are power poured into clay. As Professor Cunliffe observed, quote, the late Iron Age saw the emergence of a new elite, whose power was increasingly expressed through the access to continental trade and the conspicuous consumption of imported wine and other luxuries. End quote. Okay, the so-called Welwyn burials of Hertfordshire offered vivid proof of this new elite strategy. One grave, which was circa 10 to 15 BCE, contained bronze wine jugs, silver-rimmed cups, and Italian amphorae. Grave goods were not random. They were constructions of an image of a deceased person as a man whose status flowed from contact with Rome. As you can imagine, this would have severe consequences and, in some ways, make it easier for Rome later. If you've already got someone addicted to your supply, as the saying would go, it would be much easier to convince them to take more and to easily integrate into your system. Similar finds at Folly Lane and Baldock and Stanway show the same pattern. Imported vessels set beside local swords and torques. They express the continuity as well as the change. The old heroic feasting traditions collided with new continental symbols. Richard Hingley writes, quote, the adoption of Roman material culture by the British elites was not evidence of cultural submission, but of selected appropriation, end quote. In reality, if you wanted to look wealthy or imperial, of course you would seek to show off the similarities to your own dynasty to the Romans. All of this new fancy look, minting coins which had been imported earlier, continued to be seen as an important way, although to use them in ways that meant something to the British, but likely weren't the way that they were normally used by Romans. Think of a denarii and its worth and how much a sesterce would have been used for certain things. But to a British person who has no concept of what the value or worth of that might be, they would look at it completely differently and would be used completely differently. And I suspect that typically they were used for gift giving, very similar to the way other ancient societies did, than say something that was built around a monetary system in a financial understanding that we would be more aware of and would actually match the Roman society much better. So again, if we look at this, they would have gathered together and put all these things with the dead person. The amphora would be put in a place of honor, usually half filled with wine to kind of signal the safe passage from this life to the next and to give him the comfort that he needs to make his way to the next life. Of course, all of this would be accompanied by the usual items that he would have grown accustomed to. His signs of office, whatever that may have been, his standard equipment and other things such as swords, clothing that he cherished, all of these various things would be accompanying him into the grave as signs of how much he was honored. And now he's honored with Roman goods as well. Gaul's conquest also reshaped Britain's internal politics in ways that likely no one imagined, and slowly began to open the door, as I said earlier, to Roman influence. The Trinovantes of Essex had allied with Caesar against the Atrebates and others on the east coast of Britain. For the Atrebates, who were a transplanted Gallic people, they had maintained close continental links. Their leader, Comus, once Caesar's ally, had fled the Channel after rebelling and had become a power broker in southern Britain. From this emerged a century of complex diplomacy, British rulers using Roman contacts to outmaneuver rivals. Roman governors in Gaul used British allies to protect and project influence without invasion. By the early 1st century CE, coins bearing Latin letters and classical motifs declared the new title of kingship for these leaders. Figures like Tacicovenus and Cunobelinum minted coins inscribed with the term rex, or Latin for king, blending Celtic identity with Roman formality. Quote, across the southeast, noted archaeologist Philip de Jersey, quote, coins became the medium through which British kings expressed both independence and participation in the Roman world. Again, let us return to yet another narrative moment. And let's go to St. Alban as an example. Around a fire near what now is modern St. Albans, a rival chief argues. One boasts of his friendship with Roman merchants at Boulogne. Another spits into the flame and says, quote, they will bind us in debt before they bind us in chains, end quote. Their debate foreshadows the politics of the coming century, negotiations, suspicion, and slow recognition that the Roman world would not stay across the sea forever. Certainly you have to believe that the Britons understood that. The idea that the Romans were coming was one that must have acted like a fear word, like the Terminator saying, I'll be back. How often, of course, did the Britons encounter Romans? Well, that would depend. For most Britons, contact remained rare, and in some cases, not at all. Farmers in Wales, Scotland, and the Midlands, and north of England might live and die without seeing a single Roman face. Keep in mind, of course, that when we mention a Roman face, with the invasion of Gaul and its Romanization and pacification, it went from being a problem to a protected area, and in doing so, the Roman face might be now these Gauls who are acting as traitors and are dressing and appearing and showing off a Roman lifestyle. Cultural adoption did not happen all at once, but it seemed to create its own momentum. Think of how quickly American culture exploded into Europe post-World War II, for example, as something similar. 55 years after World War II, many people in Cardiff, where I lived, might wear New York Yankees hats. They might wear San Francisco Giants shirts and jerseys. They might wear a Star Wars shirt or a Star Trek shirt, or they might be interested in things that came from stars such as Brad Pitt or George Clooney as an example, and they may follow them religiously and track them and want to get photos with them. All of these things are signs of an America that's influence is being spread culturally, even if not militarily. And that's important. They would, of course, do this through a Welsh lens. The Welsh people living there weren't, American, and even if they have a Welsh accent, there is definitely an unmistakable sense of American culture entering into their daily life and having influence on the things they're doing and on who they are. Yet in the southeast, amongst the Returning back to this period, the Cantaceci, the Trinovantes, the Catalaveni, and the Atrabetes, contact was not brief, it was not rare, it was steady. Merchants and envoys and exiles crossed the channel each summer. Hengistbury Head and Camulodunum show continuous activity into the early 1st century from this constant need to trade goods back and forth. Of course, Rome was seen as an opportunity. It was something that would benefit a noble person who needs to get wealthy. For the average person, though, it is more mythic. A place across this big water where they have wondrous goods. Things that were impressive, that looked impressive, that were different than anything they had seen before. So they would have a sense of awe from it. And of course, that would shape their entire perspective, as Barry Cunliffe captured perfectly. Quote, Britain was not a passive fringe to the Roman world, but an active participant in the dialogue across the channel. Roman communities and British communities chose how, when, and what extent they were engaged. This becomes just simply a sign of things to come. So in the 90 years between Caesar's withdrawal and Claudius's invasion, Britain was anything but static. Its land negotiated its relationship with Rome. Elites drawing prestige from imported goods, tribes shifting alliances, ordinary people glimpsing empire through exotic fragments and supplies. And Rome did not rush to conquer Britain after Caesar, but neither did it forget the place that it had been. Each traded amphorae, each minted coin, each story of the general who came and went, bound the island a little bit closer to the empire's orbit. By the time Claudius sent his legions in 43 CE, Britain was already entangled with Rome. Through trade, politics, and memory, the conquest was not a beginning, but a culmination of a long, cautious dialogue. And we're going to continue to look into how that changed Britain. And we're going to look into how Rome advanced and grew before it came to Britain. And we'll talk a little bit more in depth about that next time we have an episode next month. Until then, we'll catch you all later. Have yourselves a great day. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, or just want to share your own opinion, please do so at my email at welshhistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can always reach out to me on most social media at welshhistorypod, or if you're looking to talk to me on Facebook, you can do so at facebook.com/welshhistorypodcast. And hey, if you'd like to help the podcast in any way, if you feel you can donate in order to help fund the research I do, you can do so through Patreon at patreon.com/welshhistory. Thank you everyone for listening and watching and viewing and all that fun stuff. And have yourselves a great day. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye. The Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information about them, please follow them at evergreenpodcastnetwork.com. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.